It's been great to meet you here at Catalysing Social Impact 2019.
Thanks, Catherine.
Yeah. So I'm wondering if you could just tell me a little bit about the work that you do at Strategos.
Sure. So Strategos works in the broad field of innovative finance. So that is to say everything from impact investments and working with social enterprises through to blended finance structures, de-risking, more mainstream capital into socially oriented, environmentally oriented structures. And there's a lot of work that we do because of my past experience in results-based financing. We work with social enterprises, institutions, and non-state actors to co-design or ideate and co-design the right structures for their specific problems or issues.
Yeah, so I've heard a fair bit about results-based financing. I'm wondering if you could tell me just a bit more about what you've noticed. What trends have you seen in that area so far?
So results-based financing isn't particularly new. Most OECD governments have been using some form of results-based financing for decades now. What the difference is in a development setting is that traditionally you've had the pay and pray sort of style of inputs-oriented contracts. When the shift moved towards more results-based financing structures in a development setting, you found that a number of the service providers didn't have the balance sheet or the risk appetite to be able to take those sorts of contracts on. So you're really winnowing out a lot of the smaller and potentially more innovative players. So the evolution over the last 5 years in a development setting is to bring in private capital and private investors so they take the risk of failure. The risk from the public sector is transferred to private capital. The service providers are still able to do their work, but with a great deal more flexibility. In traditional inputs-based contracting, you have a very strict contractual process with a very strict work plan, and doing contract variations is time-consuming, and generally you're dissuaded from doing it because of the length of time that it takes and also the sort of the friction that it creates. These new results-based financing structures, impact bonds of various ilks, pay-for-success bonds, development impact bonds, social impact bonds, they give the service providers the ability to adapt to emerging circumstances, while at the same time not putting them at risk of going bust if they don't achieve the results. It means the investors are really managing the performance really strongly, though, so it's not development as we know it. And that's one of the big things I think that people need to understand. This isn't just another way of doing development. There's a very specific set of tools for very specific issues, and they don't do a lot of the nice work that development professionals think is necessary around the institutional strengthening, the capacity building, the demand generation, all of that nice-to-have stuff. The investors aren't going to pay for that. What they're going to pay for is exactly the activities which are going to move the needle on exactly the target indicators that they're being paid to achieve.
So it sounds like these types of financing mechanisms, they might be more appropriate for certain types of problems or certain types of initiatives as compared to others.
Yeah, they're certainly not a panacea to cure all ills or a magic bullet. They're never going to completely replace your grant-based types of interventions. They are really cool, we think. The evidence is still a little out there. They're one of the tools in the toolkit. So they can be used, for example, in specific education programs, maternal and newborn health programs, agriculture and livelihoods programs, workforce development, because those have very quantifiable outcomes. But for example, they'd be totally useless in something like a governance program where you have so many variables impacting on it that it would be impossible to control it all. So very much horses for courses. That's an Australian expression. I don't know if it makes sense, but anyway.
So what are some of the other types of limitations that might be associated with these types of mechanisms? Is there maybe a risk of creating perverse incentives in certain situations? I assume during the design stage it's important to kind of factor all of these things into consideration.
Yeah, and I think you've put your finger on one of the broader problems, which is that it requires so much sophisticated thinking to get to a structure and a design which isn't going to incentivize perverse actions, that you have a really long design phase. And that's prohibitive because a situation changes very rapidly. We had a situation where we did a baseline for a piece of work. Implementation didn't start for 2.5 years after that. The situation had changed dramatically, and so we really had to hustle in order to be able to still hit the same targets. So the length of time is a problem. The cost of structuring these, the legal costs, the human resource costs, and the level of distrust, which is necessarily there when you've got Swiss bankers, any bankers potentially making money off of a development intervention, saving mothers' lives, ensuring that girls are learning to read and write and complete school. There's a real frisson there, a real tension between doing something which is an obvious public good and then rich people getting richer off that public good activity. So it's a problem. The bottom line is pay peanuts, get monkeys. Profitability and sustainability don't necessarily have to be at odds.
Yeah, because it seems as though, even during the design phase, since the incentives of all of these different players are quite different, that must be a pretty robust negotiation and probably quite time-consuming.
The only way to realize, the only way, that you've got the right solution is when nobody's happy. Really, to get that price point and to get the targets along the duration of, and it's an artificially set, a bond, say 3 or 5 years, it's just a snapshot, it's completely arbitrary. You then have to divide each of those segments so that the money doesn't get too expensive into something like 6 monthly repayments. So you've got a whole series of issues around outcome funders, the donors and governments, wanting to have impact writ large. They want to see the numbers of mothers' lives saved. Now, your investors are super worried about promising to actually save those lives, again, because there's a lot of variables impacting on it. So you've got to negotiate somewhere along this theory of change where all parties are going to be, if not happy, at least able to live with it.
Yeah, so do you think some of, what you mentioned regarding upfront transaction costs and just the timelines associated, I know that a lot of these mechanisms are still kind of, I want to say, in the proof of concept phase. Do you think some of these barriers might be cut down a bit more, the more learnings that are acquired about them?
So, yes, there's an impact bond working group which has just contracted the Government Outcomes Lab at the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford to bring all of the knowledge base together and to develop sets of templates. There's also a number of funds in development. So here in India, they're looking at developing a $1 billion education fund. Likewise in East Africa, there's also move afoot to get a $1 billion education fund. Some of the investors are looking at pooling slightly smaller amounts. These will have incrementally positive effects, but we're still looking at a couple of years before this is, really scale-oriented.
And what are some other ways that you think this market might become more accessible to a wider range of players?
Understanding terminology, the commonality of terminology across different groups. Your financiers, your investors might mean, they do mean one thing when they say equity. Development professionals understand a completely different thing by it. Until you can get that common linguistic platform, you're going to be talking at odds. And this engenders, mistrust, because when you sit down at a table or you have a conversation, you're using exactly the same words but meaning completely different things. When you get up from the table and go back to your respective offices and start working out the details, and you realise that actually people weren't understanding the same thing, this just combines. It really goes to creating an even greater disparity, discord, a chasm between the two worlds, which is the biggest problem. Money and development have been uncomfortable bedfellows for some time.
I think that's a great point. And thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me on this.
Super. My pleasure, Catherine.